Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the Settlement is the title of this week's series, or if making it a little longer, it would be the Settlement of Accounts. We can see in both passages that things are starting to come to a head. It's been building and building and starting to come to a head. So I'll start by giving us a little background with Jacob and Laban's story. And interestingly enough, when I was studying this, I feel more to give things from a point of view of Laban. So if you've been following the Jacob story with us, you see that we're at the point where Jacob has fulfilled his obligations to Laban, and he's preparing to separate from him. So keep in mind that Laban had very little before Jacob came along. And I can imagine, like any young man or growing into adulthood and stuff, he had big plans for himself. I have a 4-year-old who's obsessed with superheroes and conquering the world, and has a lot of big dreams and big ideas already. And so I can only imagine that, like all of us boys, that when Laban first laid eyes upon Jacob, a young, healthy guy whose family, that he immediately started thinking like, how can I use this guy? How can, what a blessing. The potential is high for that. And it even says in the passage that after about a month, Laban had a strong desire to make it an official working relationship. And he approached Jacob saying, you shouldn't work for me for free. How can we make an arrangement for your work? That way I can keep you around for a while. And Jacob was in love with Rachel, and Jacob said, I'll work for you for 7 years in exchange for your daughter Rachel. And Laban was very happy to go into that in agreement. And it's pretty obvious that God's blessing was on Jacob, and his flocks increased, his prosperity increased, and coming to the end of those 7 years, I'm sure it weighed a little bit on Laban's mind, saying, okay, how am I going to keep this good thing going for myself? And so, as we know, he used a technicality. On the night of the wedding, he swapped Leah for Rachel. So when Jacob came in the morning and woke up and saw Leah, he said, hey, wasn't the deal made for Rachel? And Laban, using a dirty little technicality, said, it's our custom here to marry the first daughter first. And knowing his love for Rachel, he knew that he could get Jacob for another 7 years. So he was able to get Jacob. So, I can imagine how this made Jacob feel. And he went ahead and was given Rachel and worked for that additional 7 years. And the time of that came through to fulfillment. And so you could see that Laban's plan had succeeded, and he had continued to grow his possessions, and you can see he felt very confident. And reading back for the beginning part of that, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way so that I can return to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children that I have worked for, and let me go. You know how hard I have worked for you. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Then Laban said, name your wages and I will pay them. So Jacob said to him, you know what I have done for you and your herds, for you had very little before I came, and now your wealth has increased. The Lord has blessed you because of me, and now When will I also do something for my own family?" Laban asked, "What should I give you?" And Jacob said, "You don't need to give me anything. If you do this one thing for me, I will continue to shepherd and keep your flock." And then he proceeded to make a deal. Laban, obviously, was very willing to keep it around because he acknowledged that God was the reason he was blessing, and through Jacob. So, as Carlos read to us earlier, you could see that through Jacob's skillful breeding techniques and God's blessing, that Jacob started to come into his own fruition and build his own flocks and servants and everything, while Laban's wealth plateaued and even started to decrease. So, starting next week, you will see this is bringing a rivalry into the making. And now I'm going to move forward to Luke 12. And Luke 12 starts with Jesus leaving the Pharisees and really giving them a piece of his mind. And so coming back to his disciples, and take note that he's speaking to his disciples in the beginning part. Jesus' reaction to the Pharisees was like Laban, who desire to capture God's blessing for themselves. Notice in the Laban story, one of the things that was missing was there was never mentioned that Laban tried to encounter God in any way because he had Jacob. And kind of how I look at it and what I saw was rather than trying to make his own relationship through God, as long as he had Jacob, he knew he had God. And I would venture out to say that the Pharisees had the same problem of hypocrisy. As long as they had the law, they had God. And so hypocrisy would be the first word that I would bring into this on Luke 12. And Jesus told his disciples that whatever we say in the dark will be exposed in the light. Whatever our intentions are behind things will all be shouted on the rooftops. And hypocrisy is something that is not tolerated. Be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, Jesus told his disciples. He continued through chapter 12 by telling them to fear God and to acknowledge him as the Christ. Interestingly enough, while going through that, someone from the crowd asked, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Money comes up quite often when you're talking in spiritual things, because money is the next set of things which provides possessions and provides power. And why do we like money? Because in money, we have the ability, a lot more ability to control our own destinies. The money one is something that came up a lot with me over the summer. I spent my time in Colorado 4 weeks, and most of you know that I work in ministry, work with children at Edgewood Children's Ranch. And so going back to Colorado and spending time with my family, my friends that I grew up with, people I don't see regularly, we get a lot of time to catch up. And like most men, so what are you doing now? You know, you want to talk about occupations, which is a great ministry opportunity for me. So I spent a lot of time talking with my friends and my family about working with kids, troubled kids, about the great and miraculous things that we see, the battles that we have, the struggles that we have, the victories that we have. And then it always comes up, in this world is, so how much are you making? And I know usually it's not polite to spend too much time talking about how much you're making, but I like to actually use mine because it really puts the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of man. And I only make $17,500 a year, which gets usually a long pause. See, I'm 40 now, so by the time I go back in Colorado, by the time you're 40, generally, you've got a house, you've got some cars paid off, you have kind of a retirement plan, you've got a lot of those things working for you, and that's what's going on with a lot of my friends. And so they have that long pause and kind of think about it, and so they when I explain all that, they have that, so how long are you going to do this? When are you going to get back into doing the mechanic stuff and doing that, which is just a more polite way of saying, like, how long are you going to play around before you get a real job? And my response with that has always been, is I'm going to do this as long as God is telling me to do this, and I feel like this is the way that they're leading, which usually takes a sip of your drink and then a change of subject. So, because people don't really know what to say about that. So, with that being said, Jesus does continue in the next thing to give us the cure for anxiety in the next section. So reading that would give you a good background for how to deal with that. He goes on to talk about the master's return and rewards and punishments for servants when you're waiting, which leads us up to our passage for today, which I'll start in chapter 12, starting with verse 49. He says to his disciples, "I came to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already set ablaze. But I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how it consumes me until it is finished. Do you think I came here to give peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law." Some pretty heavy words. It's interesting that he starts coming to himself in a very different way, as in bringing fire to this earth. This is a passage that's very opposite of a lot of the ways I commonly think of Jesus. But it's very interesting that I believe that this is where John the Baptist started in Luke chapter 3, verse 16. He gave a foreshadowing to this, saying, here we go. John answered them all, "I baptize you with water, but the one is coming who is more powerful than I. I am not worthy to untie the strap of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire." So we're being baptized with fire. And so what does that mean? The Holy Spirit and fire. And the fire is that we're going to be in conflict in this world. The fire is that when you start playing by a different set of rules than other people, they don't like it. It strips them of their power and prestige. It exposes their mortality. It creates confusion, which confusion often creates fear, which fear often creates persecution. People don't like what they don't understand. People don't like what they can't control. So when you start living your life according to a kingdom whose rules are totally different than the rules of this world, it's going to put you in conflict. So always keep that in mind as you're living your daily life, that it should look different than what everybody else is doing. Persecution is another one. So the three big words that I've seen between these two is hypocrisy, possessions, and persecution. Those are ways of the world. Those are the things that will turn mother against daughter. Those are the things, the subject matter that will turn people against each other. One side note that I thought was interesting that I hadn't really thought of previously, that while I was watching some YouTube and preparing for this sermon, was bloodlines. You know, often you get stuck in your reading from your own cultural point of view, but the fact that he was using families divided against each other was a huge thing in ancient Jewish culture, because the Jews stood very proud that they were the sons of Jacob, they were the sons of Israel. And when Jesus started saying son against father and mother against daughter, it's a very clear way of saying that your blood won't save you. So that's something that's very profound. And I think it can happen in these days too, depending on who your family is and who your father was and so on and so forth. But blood won't save you. So moving on to the next, interpreting the time. He also said to the crowds, now note, in chapter 12, he's been talking to his disciples more, and it lays it out in there. But now he's talking to the crowd, so he's talking to everybody, people who are skeptical, people who are learning, people who are doing those. And so that is significant, in my opinion. When you see a cloud rising in the west, right away you say, a storm is coming, and so it does. And when the south winds are blowing, you say, it's going to be a scorcher, and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky, but why don't you know how to interpret this time? And really, can we look around and see that judgment is coming? I can watch the news. Every day I can watch the news, and I can think to myself, like, Jesus is king, Jesus needs to come back. There's such a need for justice in this world. Persecution, possessions, and hypocrisy are still ruling the world. As we look and we read the news and look at it on a large scale, today's empires are slowly becoming tomorrow's ashes, just like they were 1,000 years ago, just like they were 2,000 years ago. Yet, a lot of times we get tunnel vision in where we're at right now, that we don't see that this is the direction that we're constantly moving in. So we get to the part where we come to be settling accounts. And Jesus, again, talking to the crowds, why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the ruler, make an effort to settle with him on the way, that he won't drag you before the judge, and the judge hand you over to the bailiff, and the bailiff throw you into prison. I tell you, you will never get out of there until you have paid the last cent. This passage took me back a lot because Jesus is referring to himself as the adversary. And the truth is that that God is just. And me, like everybody else, have been guilty of hypocrisy, have been guilty of putting possessions first, of putting my security in things that I can control. I've been guilty of persecution. So the word that I use all the time is scapegoating. How often do we, as a society, find someone who is voiceless to put all our anxiety on? So I'm sure if you think about it, you can think of times where that works. It works all the way from elementary school up to big politics. So, and when you're all at the playground and playing and everybody's anxious and wants to fit in, the best way to fit in is to unite under a common enemy. So you find the weird one, you find the one that is not, that is different from everybody else, and everybody can agree to put their anxiety on them. Nothing unites like a common enemy, right? So how often when you live by kingdom principles can it happen? How often does it happen throughout the world? So we can unite under a common enemy, and I've been guilty of it just the same as anybody else on a small scale and on a large scale. So it is, when you're going with your adversary to the judge, the image that popped into my head a lot was junior high age, getting called to the principal's office. And walking to the principal's office and trying to come up with an excuse in my mind for everything that I have done because I don't know why I'm being called there. So I gotta, I gotta be ready for whatever's coming at me. But the beautiful thing is, in this picture, I'm walking with my adversary to the principal's office. And my adversary does have a path for me to be reconciled before arriving at the principal's office. And so you might want to ask yourself, like, how do we reconcile with our adversary? And it's very clear through Luke and through the Bible as a whole that faith is the answer. Faith is how you reconcile with Jesus. It's faith in who he is, being the Son of God. It's faith in the baptism that he was baptized with, the sacrifice that he is getting ready to make in this passage and has made with us looking back. It's believing that he really loves you completely and shaping your life as a response to the love and forgiveness that he's given you. So, with that being said, I'm going to leave you with a little piece of The Cure for Anxiety that is so cleverly named in this section. He says, "O ye of little faith, don't keep striving for what you should eat and what you should drink, and don't be anxious. For the Gentile world eagerly seeks all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be provided for you. Don't be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Make money bags for yourselves that won't grow old, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also." Thank you.